this is my chance, and I want, I know like some of the fighters, like boxing fighter, they're not fighting in Madison Square Garden for the money or just for the victory.
So, here's what just happened to mixed martial arts. The entire landscape of professional fighting got turned upside down when Islam Makhachev, the absolute king of the UFC, just made a decision that nobody saw coming. We're talking about championship belts, career legacies, and team loyalty all getting thrown into chaos. But the most insane part? It's not even the PFL contract that's got everyone talking. It's the drama that forced him out of the UFC in the first place.
They all won 50 grand.
Well, Dana, in the end, a much more dominant fight for Islam than maybe we thought. I thought maybe it was going to be a bit more 50-50.
I agreed with you.
What did you think of his performance, Jack's performance, and the whole fight?
Yeah, I mean, not the most exciting title fight you'll ever see, but let me tell you what, complete...
This announcement just sent shockwaves through every corner of combat sports. And honestly, if you weren't paying attention, you probably missed the exact moment when everything shifted permanently for the Ultimate Fighting Championship and their most unstoppable fighter. Islam Makhachev, who's been running the UFC welterweight division and previously dominated lightweight with 4 straight title defenses that put him ahead of legends like Khabib Nurmagomedov and BJ Penn, just officially walked away from the company that turned him into a global superstar.
Yeah, I love to hear that. Okay, Islam, I'll ask you the big question to start. Why did you decide now was the time to move up to welterweight? I know we've talked about this for a very long time. They offered you the fight at UFC 300 with Leon Edwards. You couldn't do it at that time. Why was now the time to make this move?
The Professional Fighters League, which has been Dana White's biggest headache in terms of competition, just pulled off something that seemed completely impossible until now. They managed to steal away the undisputed #1 pound-for-pound fighter on earth from an organization whose president had been talking about him like he was the second coming of Muhammad Ali.
Or if Tapuria catch him, he's gonna sleep, And 2 options. Who is gonna make the game plan working?
Yeah, there's never been a 2-time lightweight champion.
And the timing? This couldn't have been more perfectly calculated or more brutal for the UFC's future plans heading in. Just a few weeks back, everyone was speculating about Makhachev headlining that legendary White House card that Dana White kept hinting at as the biggest event in company history. Now that whole vision has gone up in smoke, leaving the UFC desperately searching for someone who can even come close to filling the massive hole left by this Dagestani destroyer.
Mike Bond joined now by the #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world. It is Islam Makhachev. Also, Islam, you might be #1 traveler right now. I feel like I see you everywhere. You're in Munich, you're in Azerbaijan, you're going everywhere.
Yeah. What's up, guys? I enjoy my life now, traveling a lot. Last 2 weeks, I was in the many beautiful place.
To really grasp how massive this situation is, you need to understand exactly what Islam Makhachev represents in professional fighting. This isn't just some random fighter jumping ship for a bigger payday. We're talking about the 11th 2-division champion in UFC history completely abandoning an organization that was building their entire future around his face. His fighting record tells a story that doesn't need any interpretation. This Dagestani machine sits at 28 wins and just 1 loss, with that single defeat happening way back in October 2015 against Adriano Martins at UFC. Since that night, Makhachev has been absolutely unstoppable, putting together a 16-fight winning streak that matches Anderson Silva's UFC record for consecutive wins inside the octagon. Those exact words came from Dana White himself just weeks ago, after Makhachev completely dominated Jack Della Maddalena at UFC 322. Now those same words sound pretty bitter when you think about it. The fighter White was positioning for greatest of all time, Conversations just decided to chase that legacy somewhere else, leaving the UFC president with what has to be the worst public relations disaster in company history. That November destruction of Della Maddalena marked Makhachev's welterweight debut and his coronation as a 2-division champion. The judges scored it 50-45 all around, a complete shutout that showed total tactical dominance over a dangerous champion who had been getting better with every single fight. Makhachev overwhelmed the Australian with takedowns and ground control for 5 straight rounds, completely neutralizing the striking power that Della Maddalena had been using to destroy opponents on his way up the welterweight ladder. But apparently, the problems had been brewing long before that dominant performance at Madison Square Garden. Word is that the negotiations leading to this shocking exit started getting serious after Makhachev turned down a quick turnaround welterweight title defense at UFC 34 in January. The Dagestani champion said he didn't have enough time to prepare properly after his November fight. He wanted to come back in April, May, or June 2026, maybe at a huge event like that rumored White House card that had fight fans going crazy with excitement. But this timeline didn't match up with the UFC's aggressive scheduling plans, and that friction created an opening that the PFL was more than happy to exploit with an offer that Makhachev and his team couldn't walk away from. Nobody's revealing the exact financial details of this PFL deal, but people in the know are saying it represents the biggest guaranteed money any mixed martial artist has ever been offered by any organization outside the UFC. The PFL, backed by serious investment money and a clear goal of breaking the UFC's monopoly on elite mixed martial arts, apparently decided that signing Makhachev would be the kind of statement that could completely change how this sport works. This signing represents a massive shift in power that many people in the industry had been predicting would happen eventually, but nobody expected it to go down so suddenly or so dramatically. For years, the UFC operated as the unquestioned king of mixed martial arts, either buying out or destroying any organization that tried to challenge their dominance. Strikeforce, Pride, WEC, and countless other promotions either got acquired or became irrelevant thanks to the machine that Dana White and the Fertitta brothers built into a worldwide phenomenon. The PFL, with its unique season format and tournament structure, had carved out its own space, but never truly threatened the UFC's control over elite talent. Fighters saw the organization as either a stepping stone to UFC glory or a soft landing for those who got cut from the roster. That whole perception just changed dramatically, with Makhachev putting his name on a PFL contract, transforming this upstart promotion into a legitimate destination for the sport's absolute best. What makes this departure even more shocking is where it falls in Makhachev's career arc. He had just accomplished one of his biggest dreams by capturing a second divisional championship, putting his name next to legends like Daniel Cormier, Conor McGregor, Amanda Nunes, and Henry Cejudo as fighters who held UFC gold in multiple weight classes at the same time. His decision to give up the lightweight title before moving to welterweight had already created controversy among fans who wanted to see that iconic image of Makhachev with both belts across his shoulders. It explained that decision by saying that holding the lightweight belt for over a year while chasing welterweight gold would be disrespectful to all the contenders waiting for their shot. Now that same sense of honor and respect for competition seems to have been redirected toward a completely different organization, one that promises to give Makhachev the platform, the money, and the opponent selection control that he apparently felt the UFC wasn't willing to provide. You can't fully understand Islam Makhachev's departure from the UFC without looking at the web of drama, rivalries, and behind-the-scenes tension that had been building underneath his seemingly unstoppable championship run. While Makhachev had established himself as the most dominant fighter in the sport, his journey hadn't been smooth, with significant bumps that tested his reputation and his relationship with the organization that built him into a global superstar. The ongoing war of words with lightweight champion Ilia Topuria had reached insane levels in the weeks before this announcement. Topuria, the undefeated Georgian Spanish knockout artist, who captured the featherweight title before moving up to lightweight, had been repeatedly threatening Khabib Nurmagomedov, who serves as Makhachev's mentor and the cornerstone of his training camp. These threats had crossed lines that many people felt were inappropriate, even by combat sports standards. Topuria had claimed he would submit Makhachev, while stepping on Khabib's head if the legendary retired champion tried to get involved. Comments like these drew widespread criticism from the MMA community, while simultaneously creating the kind of heat that promoters usually love. Makhachev had responded to these provocations with his typical calm, suggesting that Topuria was upset about something and they needed to figure out what was driving his aggressive behavior. The Dagestani champion had hinted at settling things either in or out of the cage, but the underlying tension had clearly affected his relationship with an organization that seemed more interested in promoting the conflict than protecting its champions. This proposed super fight between Makhachev and Topuria had been described as potentially the biggest fight in UFC history, a clash between the consensus top two pound-for-pound fighters on the planet with legacy implications that went beyond typical championship considerations. Dana White himself had repeatedly expressed interest in making this fight happen, seeing it as a massive promotional opportunity. But according to sources close to the negotiations, the UFC's handling of this potential matchup became a major point of tension. Makhachev and his team allegedly felt that the organization was using Topuria's inflammatory comments as promotional fuel without adequately protecting their fighter's reputation and that of his team. The controversy extended beyond the Topuria feud into questions about opponent selection that had followed Makhachev throughout his welterweight championship aspirations. His expressed interest in defending against former champion Kamaru Usman, rather than rising contenders like undefeated Michael Morales or Ian Machado Gary, had drawn criticism from fans and fighters alike. Bilal Muhammad had publicly accused Makhachev of planting seeds for what he considered an easier defense, suggesting that Usman's recent record of 1 win and 3 losses in his last 4 fights didn't merit a title shot over hungrier, more dangerous contenders who had been earning their opportunities through consistent victories. Makhachev had defended his position by describing Usman as the hardest stylistic matchup available to him, noting the former champion's wrestling background, extensive experience, and status as the holder of the most welterweight title defenses in UFC history. He saw the potential Usman fight as a legacy-defining challenge rather than a calculated selection of a weakened opponent. This debate over matchmaking had revealed deeper tensions between Makhachev's vision for his career and the UFC's business interests. The organization reportedly wanted to push him toward fights that would generate maximum pay-per-view revenue, while Makhachev and his team prioritized challenges that would cement his historical legacy regardless of their commercial appeal. Past controversies had also continued to cast shadows over Makhachev's UFC tenure, despite his being cleared of any wrongdoing. The 2016 meldonium-positive test remained a talking point among critics, even though USADA had ruled it as no fault or negligence, similar to many athletes who tested positive for the heart medication during the period immediately following its addition to the banned substance list. More recently, the 2023 IV rehydration allegations following his UFC 2084 victory over Alexander Volkanovski had generated significant controversy. Dan Hooker had accused him of using a banned IV drip that exceeded permitted volumes, though Makhachev, his team, the UFC, USADA, and the relevant athletic commission all found no evidence of wrongdoing. These cleared allegations had nonetheless continued to fuel online speculation and criticism, creating an environment where Makhachev felt his achievements were being unfairly questioned. Despite his extensive testing history showing over 40 clean tests in recent years, the competitive rivalry with Arman Tsarukyan had also remained unresolved in a way that may have contributed to Makhachev's frustration with his UFC situation. Their 2019 battle at UFC Fight Night 49 had been a war that earned Fight of the Night honors, with Makhachev winning a close unanimous decision against the highly touted prospect who pushed him harder than almost any opponent in his career. A rematch had been scheduled for UFC 311 in January 2025 to determine the legitimate top dog of the lightweight division, but Tsarukyan had been forced to withdraw due to injury, replaced by short-notice opponent Renato Moicano. Makhachev had finished Moicano with a first-round DR choke, but the anticipated showdown with Tsarukyan had once again been denied. This sense of unfinished business, combined with the UFC's apparent inability or unwillingness to make the fights Makhachev wanted when he wanted them, had contributed to a growing disconnect between the champion and the organization. His fighting style had made him must-see television for technical purists, but hadn't always translated into the crossover appeal that the UFC prioritizes when building its biggest stars. Makhachev's grappling dominant approach, rooted in Dagestani combat sambo and freestyle wrestling, emphasized control, patience, and relentless pressure rather than the spectacular knockouts that casual fans crave. His elite chain wrestling with body locks, trips, single and double leg takedowns, and seamless transitions had proven virtually unstoppable against the best competition in the world. But some had labeled his style as boring or unwatchable. The welterweight title victory over Jack Della Maddalena had exemplified this tension perfectly. Those scorecards reading 50-45 across the board represented total domination, yet the fight had drawn criticism for its lack of exciting exchanges. Makhachev had done exactly what his style demanded: close distance, safely, avoid risks, and grind out a dominant decision on the mat. His exceptional cardio and fight IQ had made him impossible to finish, but these same qualities had sometimes worked against him in the court of public opinion. The uncertainty in Dana White's voice when discussing Makhachev's future had been obvious, and sources suggest that the champion had interpreted this ambiguity as evidence that the UFC was unwilling to commit to the vision he had for his remaining fighting years. The personal side of this equation can't be ignored either. Makhachev, known for his intensely private family life, has 3 children and a wife whose identity remains undisclosed in accordance with Dagestani cultural traditions. The demands of being a 2-division champion while maintaining his training base in Russia and traveling the world for promotional obligations had taken a toll that few outside his inner circle fully understood. The PFL, according to those familiar with the negotiations, had offered not just a financial package that dwarfed anything the UFC was willing to provide, but also scheduling flexibility and opponent selection input that would allow Makhachev to balance his championship ambitions with his responsibilities as a father and husband. The consequences of Islam Makhachev's departure from the UFC go way beyond one fighter's career path, touching every part of the mixed martial arts landscape and potentially reshaping the competitive dynamics of the entire sport. For the UFC, this represents an unprecedented failure of fighter retention at the absolute peak of an athlete's abilities. The organization has lost champions before to retirement, to other sports, and occasionally to rival promotions, but never has a fighter of Makhachev's caliber, dominance, and marketability walked away while holding a championship and standing atop the pound-for-pound rankings. The immediate impact will hit the welterweight division hard, where Makhachev's departure leaves a championship vacuum that must be filled through a process that the UFC has yet to announce. The most likely scenario involves an immediate title fight between top contenders, potentially pitting the likes of Shavkat Rakhmonov against Michael Morales, or another highly ranked competitor to determine a new champion. The financial implications for the UFC cannot be overstated. Makhachev had been positioned as a cornerstone of the promotion's international expansion strategy, particularly in regions like Russia, the Middle East, and Central Asia, where his dominance and his connection to the legendary Khabib Nurmagomedov made him an incomparable draw for new audiences. That rumored White House card that Dana White had been teasing as a historic event now faces an enormous obstacle. Makhachev had been widely expected to headline that card, potentially in a super fight against Ilia Topuria or in a legacy defense against a top contender. Without him, the UFC must find another attraction capable of justifying the political and logistical complexity of staging an event at such a prestigious venue. For the PFL, this signing represents validation of their ambitious strategy to challenge the UFC's dominance by acquiring elite talent willing to leave the sport's established leader. The organization had previously struggled to attract fighters at the absolute peak of their abilities, often serving as a destination for veterans on the decline or young prospects not yet ready for the UFC's gauntlet. Makhachev changes that narrative entirely. His presence in the PFL immediately elevates the organization's credibility and creates genuine intrigue about whether other top fighters might follow his lead. If the UFC's pound-for-pound best can find greener pastures elsewhere, what does that mean for champions and contenders who have been frustrated by their own compensation or treatment? The comparison to boxing's multi-promotional landscape becomes increasingly relevant. For decades, the UFC has maintained a near monopoly on elite mixed martial arts talent, with rival organizations unable to compete for the sport's biggest names. Makhachev's departure suggests that this dynamic may be shifting, potentially leading to a future where top fighters can choose between legitimately competitive options rather than accepting whatever terms the UFC offers. For Makhachev himself, this move represents a calculated gamble with his legacy that could pay enormous dividends or leave questions that can never be answered. His resume inside the UFC octagon is virtually spotless. Victory over Charles Oliveira for the vacant lightweight title, 2 wins over Alexander Volkanovski, including a highlight reel knockout, a gutsy submission victory over Dustin Poirier, and a dominant championship performance against Jack Della Maddalena at welterweight. The question that will now follow him is whether the PFL can provide competition worthy of his talents. Critics will argue that leaving the UFC at his peak means we'll never know how he would have fared against Topuria, against a fully healthy Tsarukyan in a rematch, or against the murderer's row of welterweight contenders who had been circling for title shots. Supporters will counter that Makhachev has already proven everything he needs to prove, having submitted the submission king in Oliveira, knocked out the pound-for-pound great Volkanovski, and dominated everyone else, placed in front of him with a combination of wrestling brilliance and increasingly dangerous striking. The path that brought Makhachev to this moment had been paved with sacrifice and determination that began long before he ever set foot inside the UFC octagon. Born in Makhachev, Dagestani, and raised in the remote village of Bershi, he came from humble beginnings that forged the iron will required to reach the pinnacle of combat sports. His father worked as a driver and tomato farmer. His mother ran a small cafe, and young Islam was involved in the street fights common in the region long before formal martial arts training shaped his raw talents. Training under the legendary Abdulmanap Nurmagomedov, Khabib's father and one of the most respected coaches in combat sports history, had instilled in Makhachev the technical foundation and mental discipline that would carry him to championship glory. When Abdulmanap passed away in 2020, the loss devastated the entire team, but also strengthened their resolve to honor his legacy through continued excellence. The brotherly bond between Makhachev and Khabib Nurmagomedov had been central to his development and would undoubtedly influence whatever comes next in the PFL. Khabib's role as mentor, training partner, and spiritual guide had shaped Makhachev into the complete fighter and human being, who now stands at this crossroads in his career. The career clock that Makhachev has acknowledged played a significant role in this decision. At 34 years old, he has perhaps 3 to 4 years remaining at the elite level, and the PFL contract reportedly guarantees him more financial security for his family in that window than the UFC was willing to provide. His mentor Khabib Nurmagomedov's influence on this decision cannot be understated. Khabib, who retired undefeated and has since focused on developing fighters and business ventures, has consistently emphasized the importance of protecting one's legacy while also securing generational wealth. Makhachev's move aligns perfectly with the philosophy that Khabib has espoused since walking away from the sport at the top of his game. The MMA community's reaction has been predictably divided. Longtime fans who respect fighter autonomy and believe in competitive markets have celebrated Makhachev's decision as a blow against monopolistic control. Others, particularly those invested in seeing potential super fights and legacy-defining matchups inside the UFC octagon, have expressed disappointment that some dream fights will never materialize. What cannot be disputed is that this moment represents a turning point in the sport's history. The UFC's grip on elite talent has weakened for the first time in meaningful ways, and the consequences of that shift will play out over years rather than months. For Islam Makhachev, the Dagestani dominator who trained under Abdulmanap Nurmagomedov, who carries on the legacy of Khabib's legendary career, and who compiled one of the most impressive resumes in UFC history, a new chapter begins. His record of 28-1 stands as testament to his dominance. His 16-fight winning streak ties the all-time UFC record, and his collection of championship belts includes titles in 2 weight classes. Whether the PFL can provide challenges worthy of that legacy remains the biggest question hanging over this entire situation. But one thing is certain, the world of mixed martial arts will never be quite the same after the day Islam Makhachev officially quit the UFC to join the Professional Fighters League. The training camp that Khabib recently opened in the mountains of Dagestani, the one that Makhachev had spoken so fondly about in recent interviews, will now serve as headquarters for a team that operates outside the UFC ecosystem entirely. The beautiful but dangerous roads leading to that remote facility, the horses that Makhachev has been collecting at his farm, the quiet family life he guards so jealously from public scrutiny, all of these elements of his existence outside the octagon will continue unchanged, even as his profession circumstances undergo this radical transformation. The MMA world watches now with bated breath to see what comes next. Will other dissatisfied UFC champions follow Makhachev's lead to the PFL? Will the competition between organizations drive up fighter compensation across the board? Will the super fights that seemed possible in the UFC octagon somehow materialize across promotional lines through the kind of cross-promotional agreements that have become common in boxing? These questions will take months and years to answer fully. For now, what we know with absolute certainty is that Islam Makhachev, the pound-for-pound best fighter on the planet, the man who conquered 2 UFC divisions and tied the all-time win streak record, has made the most shocking career decision in modern MMA history. And nothing about the sport will ever look quite the same again